And joining us now to discuss the Afghan mission from the nation's capital, there's John Manley, Canada's former Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Manley, it's good to have you on the line. How are you tonight?
I'm very well. Thank you, Stephen.
Great. We want to start by just reading an excerpt from General Stanley McChrystal's report. He's, of course, in charge of the NATO forces over there. And then I'll come back and put a question to you after that. Here we go. The situation in Afghanistan, he says, is serious. Neither success nor failure can be taken for granted. Although considerable effort and sacrifice have resulted in some progress, many indicators suggest the overall situation is deteriorating. Success is achievable, but it will not be attained simply by trying harder or, quote, doubling down on the previous strategy. Just off the top, what do you think of that assessment?
I think it sounds remarkably similar to what our panel said about 18 months ago, that a different approach was required, a lot more focus on how we win the hearts and minds of Afghan people, which I think is what General McChrystal is trying to say.
Here's another quote. There's an urgent need for a significant change to our strategy and the way we think and operate. If that's true, how flawed, in your view, is the current strategy?
Well, I think there have been a few problems with the strategy that U.S. forces particularly were following. A couple of things come to mind. The concern about civilian casualties was not nearly great enough. Secondly, there's been a tendency to think that this struggle could be won by flat-out military means without enough concern being paid to really winning over the population, to supporting development efforts, humanitarian efforts, and to ensuring that the government of Afghanistan got the governance piece of this whole equation right. So I agree with the General on this one also. Okay,
let me spend a few minutes now following up on a number of those things that you just raised. I guess the lead in all of this was the notion that the U.S., General McChrystal anyway, wants another surge, as what happened in Iraq. He wants 40,000 more boots on the ground over there in order to achieve the job. And I guess, first of all, let's all make sure we're speaking the same language here. What still, in your view, is the job?
Well, the job, in my view, is to maintain security for, first for the Afghan people, but secondly, for the efforts that are being made to support development and humanitarian efforts in Afghanistan, while the government of Afghanistan is becoming capable of maintaining security for themselves. That is the important dynamic element to this, that at the outset there were no real Afghan security forces, no Afghan National Army, no Afghan National Police Force. Those are really being constructed out of nothing and are increasingly gaining capability, but are well short of being able to maintain security across the country on their own at this point in time.
And how high on the priority list is identifying and killing members of Al-Qaeda?
Well, members of Al-Qaeda are, many of them have fled Afghanistan and are in other places at this point. I think that the complaint that we've had collectively with the Taliban has been that they provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda in the period of time leading up to 9/11. The Taliban represent a repressive and difficult regime, but they're not Al-Qaeda. There may be some elements of Al-Qaeda. If you can find them and catch them and prosecute them, all the better. But the insurgency in Afghanistan is not being led by Al-Qaeda.
How about General McChrystal's view that he needs a lot more troops on the ground there? Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And again, we said that in the panel's report 18 months ago. I mean, the number of troops that NATO had in Afghanistan was well short of what would be required. It was roughly the same number as were in Bosnia or in Kosovo, much smaller countries and much more passive in terms of the challenges being faced. So this effort has been under-resourced from the outset.
Let's explore some of President Obama's options at this point, and to that end I'm going to read you an excerpt from the Washington Post from a couple of days ago. From the Post. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden has argued against increasing the number of U.S. combat troops in Afghanistan, currently scheduled to total 68,000 by the end of the year. He favors preserving the current force levels, stepping up Predator drone strikes on al-Qaeda leaders, and increasing training for Afghan forces. Like many congressional Democrats, Biden is concerned that deploying more U.S. troops could be counterproductive, giving the Taliban more fodder to foment public opposition to the foreign occupation. I guess you two are on opposite sides of this one. Is that fair to say?
Well, one of the things that I learned when I was in Afghanistan in August for the election campaign, and this came from one of the unsuccessful candidates, Ashraf Ghani, who was the former finance minister, who told us that the Taliban narrative is not particularly that you've got to get the foreign forces out of Afghanistan. That had been the case earlier on, but increasingly it was that the government of Afghanistan was corrupt, and that the foreign forces were just propping up a corrupt regime and not doing anything to improve the lives of ordinary Afghans. So I'm inclined to the view that first of all, you've got to create a secure situation for Afghan citizens. Secondly, you've got to address the belief that's got to lurk in the hearts of every Afghan that once again foreign forces will turn tail and leave. And if that's the prospect, and if you're getting serious pressure from Taliban to support them, and you think they're going to be there and the foreign forces are not, then you're going to hedge your bets if you're a thinking Afghan. And that's one of the problems that we've had. I think a clear statement that we're committed to see this through, at least on the part of the United States, is going to be an important element to winning the support of ordinary Afghan citizens.
But you know as well as anybody, given your time in politics, that politics is the art of the possible. And when you consider what's possible or perhaps more realistic, Joe Biden's plan is more politically possible, I suppose, than General McChrystal's at the moment. Would you not agree with that?
Well, I don't know that I'm an expert in how the U.S. political system will work once the president makes up his mind and decides what he wants to do. He has got a majority in both houses of Congress, and it's going to be important for him to give leadership to this once he decides what strategy he wants to follow.
The Taliban, I mean, the fear is that if the Taliban is allowed to reorganize and take over the governing of the country again, that they will once again provide safe haven to, terrorist elements like Al-Qaeda. Do you share that concern?
Well, I think that's an element of concern. I also have concern about the fact that when they were in power in Afghanistan before, they violated essentially every principle of human rights that known to us. Not a few of them, but everyone. It was a brutal regime. Some members of it really deserve to be brought before the International Criminal Court. And I think that to leave the Afghan people to that kind of outcome would be the last thing that we'd want to do.
What about the notion that 40,000 more Western troops in Afghanistan will do more to foment a sense of occupation in the country and will be a great recruiting poster for Al-Qaeda? Do you believe in that?
I'm not sure that it's the sense of occupation that's our greatest risk now. I personally believe that the sense that Western forces don't have the staying power and that ultimately the Taliban will prevail is our greatest problem. Afghan citizens, and I talk to not to thousands of them, but certainly to many of them, want security. Many turned out to vote, despite the risks that entailed. Yes, the turnout in the election was down from what it was the last time, but over 40% of the electorate turned out to vote. In a by-election in Toronto a couple of weeks ago, we had 25%, and nobody was threatening to cut off their fingers if they voted. So these people do have a huge commitment to their country and to their future, and I don't think it's as simple as this is a foreign occupation and Afghans generally want to see it chased out of the country. There are certainly concerns about civilian casualties, and I think the approach that General McChrystal has taken, which has actually seen civilian casualties caused by the Taliban exceeding in number the civilian casualties caused by ISAF forces, that's that's a good thing. Whether that change has occurred in time is another question.
And let me give you the other side, though, of the coin that you just put forward, which is you were in Afghanistan as an election observer. I guess you know as well as anybody that President Karzai and his supporters were alleged to have really rigged that election, and there's certainly a lot of evidence come forward to suggest that's true. How does the tainted nature of his government affect NATO's ability to achieve all of the things that we've been talking about so far?
I think it's a big problem. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you can't make this crystal clear one way or another, or very simple. When you go into a failed state like Afghanistan, and there are other candidates around the world, and we'll see them again in the decades to come, there's no government in a box that you can go in and say, okay, here we go. You've got to work with the people that are there. You've got to work with, you've got to try to build local institutions. You've got to give people support and skills. You've got to insist on governance practices that are acceptable according to international norms. But there are no guarantees. There's no doubt. When taking this on, this is one of the toughest places on the planet. But we've got a lot invested there, and I think before we write off that investment, we better be very sure that there's no other better outcome.
Okay, so you know for the second time in 6 months, the President of the United States is considering his options, whether to maintain the current strategy or change strategy. He's got, on the one hand, Stanley McChrystal telling him a surge, more boots on the ground. He's got Joe Biden saying, careful, you don't want this to be your Vietnam. He's got his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, playing cards very close to the chest right now, as is Mr. Gates, the Defense Secretary. So, what's your advice? What should he do?
Well, if I were sitting with President Obama and advising him, which is quite distinct, by the way, from trying to advise the Canadian government, I would say that he should take very seriously the advice that he's received from General McChrystal. He chose General McChrystal, asked him to go in and assess the situation. He's given him a very thoughtful report, and furthermore, President Obama has already staked out territory on this. In his March speech, he identified Iraq as a war of choice, Afghanistan as a war of necessity.
He's been saying that for 2 years, as long as he campaigned for the job.
I think that's exactly right, and for him to change course on that now will require some explaining. And I think that he has to really draw a clear distinction in his own mind and that of the American peoples between Afghanistan and Vietnam.
But he's got people in his own party telling him that he's on the road to Vietnam if he allows this to overwhelm his presidency. Forget about health care, forget about green energy, forget about fixing the economy. This is going to take over his agenda if he does what McChrystal wants. How does he walk that balance?
Well, he has to assess the advice that he receives. That's why he gets paid the big bucks. You know, as I say, this is not an easy one. Mm-hmm. This is not black and white. If I had to make the decision, I'd have to weigh all of those things too. But if your question to me was, what advice would I give him? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, what trade-offs there might be in his political agenda in the United States. I do know what his country has so far invested and what he personally has indicated with respect to the situation in Afghanistan. That is not going to go away. The solution that you pull back and you send some drones in and you fire missiles now and then at Al-Qaeda, if in fact there are any in Afghanistan, while you watch that country revert to a medieval totalitarian regime where women have no role at all and many men are treated harshly for the fact that they were perceived to have accommodated American troops when they were there. That's not a nice outcome either, Steve. And I think for President Obama, it's going to be a very tough call.
Well, but again, let's get back to the politics. How do you fire McChrystal's predecessor, saying you're not sure about his strategy, give McChrystal the job, somehow his recommendations get leaked, and then turn him down? If you turn him down, you got to fire him too, don't you? McChrystal can't very well, implement a policy he doesn't believe in, and we know what he believes right now.
I think if he does not accept the general's advice, I doubt very much that he would need to fire him. I think the general would ask to be relieved of his command, having been very clear and very public about what he thought needed to be done.
Mr. Manley, in our last 30 seconds, do you still think this Afghanistan mission is winnable?
I think all along I've thought you have to be careful to define what you mean by winnable. But I think that with proper resources, with a commitment to winning over the Afghan people by providing development assistance, supporting their governance efforts, that we can leave Afghanistan a much better place than it was before, and not contributing to instability in its region of the world. Yes.
Mr. Manley, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Steve.